Adam, Posen, is there anything good that can come from Brexit?
No.
Well, leave and take back control. I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
The European Union was a noble dream in the last century, but today it has failed. It has turned into a nightmare.
Well, it's quite interesting in that for years now we have had the right wing saying that the European Union is falling apart. But Donald Trump is actually potentially unifying Europe as countries in the economic zone, the European economic zone, are considering joining the European Union, or at least getting closer to the European Union. Since Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, all polling shows that actually the vote for Brexit, or for not being in the EU, was at a peak in that vote in 2016, and continually support for being in the European Union has grown in the United Kingdom. To date, polling shows that in the high 60s, the British people want closer alignment with the European Union. They are prepared to accept freedom of movement for access to the single market. But this government appear to be deaf to the polls and continue with trying to get a trade deal with Donald Trump. Last spring, the Labour Party, when they were in opposition, actually went out in America with the Heritage Foundation, alongside the Legaton Institute and a Tory MP. And this was to try and begin talks with Donald Trump in case he won the presidency. Well, of course, he did, and he's preparing to come into office in January. But this government says it wants a reset with Europe as well, but you can't have a trade deal with the USA and get closer alignment with the European Union. Indeed, Norway is in this same predicament, and it seems that they're weighing up whether to become the 51st state of the USA, or a Puerto Rico, it says, or whether to join to become a member of the European Union. And the advantages of being a member of the European Union are strong for Norway. Given its wealth and clout, it would be given a seat at the top table with considerable influence that we enjoyed when we were members. Then Switzerland is trying to get rid of the friction in trade and aligning more in standards, and that deal has been done recently. Added to that, Iceland is also committing to hold a referendum to join the European Union, despite the fact that polling shows only around 45-46% of its people are actually in favour of joining the European Union. But that 45% is considerably stronger than it was a few years ago. In fact, across all of these countries, support for joining the European Union has been rising over time because of Donald Trump, Brexit, and the rise of the far right. It is only Britain that is still intent on continuing with this tomfoolery of being in no man land Brexit with no protection whatsoever.
Iceland's new government has said it aims to put the question of EU membership to a referendum by 2027. The incoming administration of Prime Minister Kristrún Frostadóttir, which takes over on Sunday, also said it will set up a panel to look into the benefits of joining the Eurozone. According to a poll conducted by market research company Maskiner in June, support for EU membership among Iceland's population is growing. That poll found just over 54% of respondents were in favour of joining the bloc, with the majority saying they thought households would be financially better off as part of the EU. Frostadottir, who is the leader of the centre-left Social Democratic Alliance, also said she aims to cut inflation and interest rates. Her party won November's snap elections, called after the previous coalition government led by Bjarni Benediktsson collapsed due to infighting.
Meanwhile, the right-wing media, who go on about the massive democratic vote of 2016, have launched a campaign to save Brexit. They ignore the polling which shows a majority for rejoin and are fighting to save Brexit from democracy.
Obama has been accused of setting up a surrender squad at the heart of government. In Whitehall, there's allegations of a 100-strong civil service unit that has been set up as part of the renegotiation with Brussels next year. Over the weekend, we've seen many critics of the Prime Minister, the likes of Kemi Badenoch, Lord Frost, the Brexit negotiator, who have come out very, very strongly against this. One thing that Sir Keir Starmer has been talking about ever since he got into Downing Street has been the whole reset with Brussels, with the European Union. He wants to have better relations with the EU bloc, better than what Boris Johnson had or Rishi Sunak had over the last few years. Now, as part of that Brexit deal and us leaving the European Union, there was always going to be a moment of renegotiation. Now, that just so happens to come up next year. Now, as part of that negotiation, Brussels has come up with a list of key demands to get that to see the second part of our Brexit deal. And Brexiteers on this side of the continent are pretty angry with what they see. Some of the areas that are being looked at from Brussels are the European Court of Justice, how that may intrude more upon our lives. Brexiteers, of course, voted to leave the bloc because they wanted to see no influence of the European Court of Justice. One other issue that has come up is the youth mobility scheme. Europeans are very, very keen to get a youth mobility scheme, which will basically mean anyone from the age of 18 to 30 will be able to work in the United Kingdom, but also get access to healthcare and the like when they come over, and that will be a reciprocal agreement as well. A couple of other key areas are fishing rights and trade and security. But the trouble is, once we align more with Brussels, it could mean and put in jeopardy trade deals around the world that we want to sign with other countries where we can take advantage of those freedoms and opportunities of leaving, which we did, obviously, in 2016. So some of the big names that have got on board with the Sun's campaign to save Brexit are the likes of ex-cabinet minister Jacob Rees-Mogg. He says that the government are trying to take us back into the European Union by stealth. Other names who have signed up already are the ex-Brexit minister Steve Baker and David Jones, and also Lord Frost will be speaking to us in the newspaper and online tomorrow. So there's a lot of anger against what is seen as this surrender squad and the giving away of those freedoms and rights that were won nearly 10 years ago.
Ongoing source of chronic pain for the UK for the next several years. And it is going to put the UK in many ways back to where it was in the 70s and early 80s of being uncompetitive, people having less faith in the stability of the regime, and having to rebalance in very interventionist ways.
Meanwhile, the main Brexit cheerleader, Boris Johnson, gave an interview in New Zealand, and he now confirms that Brexit has indeed taken us back to the 1970s, as Remainers like Adam Posen said it would.
You may well are. I mean, that's right. I mean, I've come to New Zealand, but lots of people are fleeing the UK at the moment, and it's very sad. I mean, lots of the wealth creators are just upping sticks, and they're going to Dubai. They're going to Milan, for heaven's sake. Well, not since the 1970s have I known an actual emigration problem in the UK, where we had people literally leaving, talented people, because they didn't want to work in the UK anymore. I mean, the UK has always been a magnet. My working lifetime, it's been a magnet for talent, and it's very, very sad.
Posen, is that what the UK faces in 2017?
The answer is simply yes. It's not going to be as bad or as painful as the stagflation of the 1970s, but it is stagflation. It's a negative supply shock combined with very low productivity, which means inflation goes up and growth goes down. All that's happened is the confidence of the consumer, housing builders, and so on in the UK, fueled by some nonsense in the political sphere, kept them having faith in the UK economy that wasn't merited for the last few months. They're now waking up to reality.
What does this mean for the Bank of England, Adam? Because we're now actually seeing that, bets are increasing on a rate hike from the Bank of England. But would that hurt the bank's credibility, do you think, to make that sort of about face after they, have just eased?
Central banks always are reluctant to make an about face, but they never should let that interfere with doing the right thing. The real issue for the bank and for the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, is assessing how much this inflation shock gets transmitted through to the whole economy. So when I was on the MPC in 2009-10, we had a very large decline in sterling, and inflation shot up to 5%, and we looked through it, but I think it's different this time. I think it's different because there's much less faith in the UK economic regime. I think it's different because gilt prices are moving down rather than up. And I think it's different because this is a UK-specific shock. So the markets aren't crazy to price in some possibility of a hike.
You referred to a number there, which is 5%. I just wonder, Adam, does Carney have the appetite to allow inflation to run up to 5% before? Would that be his tolerance level before he hikes rates, or is there a lower benchmark?
I don't think the issue is so much the level, because if it goes to, say, 3.5%, but it goes to 3.5% at a time when gilt yields are rising, at a time when the government of the UK is doing large fiscal stimulus, possibly, and at a time when the current account is widening, is widening, then 3.5% inflation would be bad. The 5% inflation we tolerated a few years ago was when expectations were anchored, gilt prices were anchored, and there was plenty of room to do QE. So I think they have to look at it differently. It's looking at the inflation expectations, like the five-year, not the level.
Talking about sterling as well, Adam, I think you have shown some concern already about how far this has fallen, and of course the impact that would have on inflation and the economy. I mean, if we see sterling take another leg lower, what are the wider impacts of that beyond, of course, the impact that we've already seen on inflation?
Well, I think concern is not quite the right word, because sterling, as many people have remarked, essentially has to go down. If you don't have sterling go down when you've had a negative supply shock and a hit to the current account competitiveness, then you got to have a huge compression of wages and imports. I mean, that's essentially what happened to Greece, and you don't want that to happen to the UK. So if anything, I would expect sterling to go further down, and I would expect sterling to move more against the euro than it has, because it's actually moved too much against the dollar and less against the euro, whereas where they need the readjustment is with the euro.
Adam, our editor-in-chief caught up with James Gorman over in the United States. So I'm talking about Mr. Micklethwaite and James Gorman. And when he asked him, was there anything good about Brexit?
Right.
I can shorten this response, Adam, actually. There's nothing good about Brexit. So that's Gorman's words, right, not mine. In your opinion, Adam, let's try and step back for just a moment, because this onslaught is of negativity, hard Brexit, dirty Brexit. Adam, Posen, is there anything good that can come from Brexit?
No.
Well, do you know what? Do you know what? You can see James Gorman in a game of poker, and you can raise him, because that is, in a word, no. Then tell me this.
Sorry.
Is it just death by 1,000 cuts for this country? What do we face?
No,
Let's go forward 10 years in Posen's view. What's the view?
Right. So let's step it back. I mean, it can be very unquestionably bad and have no positive aspects but still not be terminal, right? So it can be that you have an injury and you get arthritis and you can't play the sports you used to play and you have to take a bunch of painkillers, but in the end it's not fatal and it doesn't destroy your life. I think that's the way to think about Brexit. It's going to be an ongoing source of chronic pain for the UK for the next several years, and it is going to put the UK in many ways back to where it was in the 70s and early 80s of being uncompetitive, people having less faith in the stability of the regime, and having to rebalance in very interventionist ways. So 10 years from now, will the economy have survived it? Of course. Will the city have survived it? Yes, in shrunken form. Will the average British person be worse off economically? Yes. The only way it's going to be able to be claimed a victory or something good is if, God forbid, something terrible happens in Europe. And then they can say, well, relatively speaking, it was good we weren't part of that. And I suppose that's possible. But even then, that's not going to protect the UK because even outside the EU, most of its trade is with the EU. So, it's not good. It's not the end.
I'm glad you mentioned the EU, because is this in fact in any way going to be more painful for Europe then? I mean, we get French GDP data later, but is this more of a problem for wider Europe than the UK, or is the UK going to take most of the pain?
I think the UK takes most of the pain, but I think the important thing, which you're implying and which I agree with, is that this was a mutually beneficial relationship. And so if you pull back from the relationship, the pain is on both sides. And the pain will be much less for the large European bloc than it is for the UK, but it will be there. And the pain primarily is going to be through the political aspect of, obviously, people more worried about fragmentary parties and right-wing parties and anti-Europe parties in Europe than they had been. And it's going to be the uncertainty that Scotland and Northern Ireland have as spillovers, which again is primarily bad for the UK, but has effects on the EU.
The European Union was a noble dream in the last century, but today it has failed. It has turned into a nightmare.
If we as a country decide to quit, then we're out for good. There's no going back.
What benefits are there for small business owners of remaining in the EU, as I can't see any?
We wouldn't have a seat at the table, and if we wanted to trade in the EU, the other countries could put on tariffs and taxes.
The in-campaigner, the chair of the in-campaign, Sir Stuart Rose from Marks and Spencer's, he said, it's not going to be a step change or somebody's going to turn the lights out. And then he went off very, very importantly, wages will go up.
We are the world's fifth biggest economy, and most economies can agree free trade deals within 2 years. The European Union is taking 10 years or never at all. Why? Because 28 member states cannot even organise a takeaway curry, let alone what they're going to do on free trade with the rest of the world.
All right.
They lied about the costs of Europe. They lied about Turkey's entrance to Europe. They lied about the European army because we've got a veto over that. They put these in their leaflets, and they've lied about this here tonight too, and it's not good enough. You deserve the truth. You deserve the truth.
My family and I have had first-hand experience recently with the NHS. How would it manage if we left the EU, given the UK's inability to train and retain sufficient doctors and nurses?
What we think should happen is an Australian-style points-based system.
You might start off with Parachu saying how wonderful immigration is, but your campaign hasn't been Project Fair. It's been Project Hate as far as immigration is concerned.
Is it a coincidence that the longest period of peace in European history has happened at the same time as the emergence of the European Union?
When the head of Europol, who's a Brit, says we're safer in the EU, I listen. When the head of MI5 and MI6 says we're safer in the EU, I listen. And when all of our major allies, America, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, say we're safer in the EU, I listen. And if it comes to a choice, if it comes to a choice to listening to all of these people, even if they're experts, or listening to these three about who keeps my family safe, I'm going to vote for them every single day of the week and twice on a Sunday. Don't risk it.
As long as the European Union keeps trying to copy what NATO does, if the countries across Europe are not paying their 2% of the GDP, which is the NATO contribution, we will be weakening it.
But stay and fight, don't quit. Let's stay and persuade our allies to pay the 2%. Why are you a quitter?
Okay.
We're better than that.
Okay.
We can do it.
Sadiq, we heard earlier that the Prime Minister was meant to have got a deal. That a deal amounted to absolutely nothing. It's temporary.
Britain is better off in. You are better off in. There is nothing more positive than having a stronger economy, supporting jobs and opportunities. And that's why I believe you should vote Remain. Thank you.
If we vote Leave and take back control, I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
I have real concerns about this, because whether you supported Brexit or not, it's back to this blooming old argument of whether you supported it or not, there was a democratic decision.
Yeah, it was.
And therefore, shouldn't that be carried through? Well, of course, as Peter quite rightly says, the government says, well, we're not reversing Brexit, we're not going back into the EU, but we are doing, actually, all these other things, which basically means we may as well be back in.
But what worries me then is we're going to have to pay a price for that, because, I mean, look at the attitude of the rest of the European Union when we did pull out. It was very much as though they wanted to punish us.
Yeah.
Why would they indulge us by giving us the bits back that we want? You know, like freedom of movement for students or whatever.
But why
they will want us to pay a price.
Why do we even want freedom of movement for students?
Some students do.
Some students do, but it's got to be the minority. It's got to be a minority. So we've got plenty of students who go in and out of the United States. There's not freedom of movement there, so there's got to be ways around it for the very few who want to do it. I don't know. I just think it's extraordinary, all this sort of thing. And
I'm just worried they'll pull back the bits they sound what they want, what Labour has always wanted, I guess, and we'll have to pay quite a steep price for it in certain ways. Don't quite know how, but deals will be done that we may not be entirely happy about.
I just think, what damage does it do to the democratic process in this country if something happens and a few years later it's just all...
Yeah, it was a referendum.
All but reversed in everything but name. Then what's the point? How do we have any faith in anything that we vote for anymore?
Well...
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below, let me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe.
She's pretty, isn't she? She's old now, though. She's got to be... I think Daisy must be about 11 now.